Hi, everyone. I'm Gord Perks, and I'm here to have a conversation with you about policing in the city of Toronto, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the effects of policing generally on racialized people in the city of Toronto. This is a bit of a different format for me to put out a video like this, but I'm doing it because since a constituent of Ward 4, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, died during an interaction with the Toronto Police, I've received over 60,000 emails from people who want us to take action. There have also, of course, been many other incidents in Canada recently and incidents in the United States. And there is a strong, frankly, unique outpouring of public grief, rage, and protest right around the world. Partly because of COVID, and also because just so many people want to have this conversation. We can't do a normal public meeting or town hall. It's also just not possible for me to speak to every one of the constituents who's reached out to me. So we're going to do a bit of a different format. Last week, my staff and I were talking about how we could communicate about what's going on with all these issues in Toronto. And Catherine, who I'll introduce in a moment, said, I wish we could just show the video of the conversation we're having as an office. So we hit on the idea of having my staff ask me some of the questions you've been asking in emails and phone calls, and having a bit of a conversation between the four of us. I'd like now to introduce the staff who are with me today. Clive Scott, Catherine Martin, and wave guys, and Dusha Sritharan, who work in assisting me on policy development, working with community groups, and talking to constituents throughout Ward 4. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to, I guess, Clive, who's going to ask me the first question.
Yeah, and just to you kind of said there, but yeah, it's the current climate. With COVID and the fact that everyone's at home, when the incident with George Floyd happened, it definitely kind of, everyone was paying attention to it. And it does feel kind of different now. And the incident with George Floyd, and then with Regis, we got hundreds of phone calls. And a lot of people were asking for justice for Regis. And then to questions and concerns around police funding. So we've got a lot of demands for defunding the police. What does that mean when they say defund the police?
So there's been a lot of concern about how police interact with people in a variety of different circumstances. The most obvious one in the recent weeks has been when there's what the police call a wellness check or a mental health check. And it's important to remember that Regis died after police had been phoned by her family members who were concerned about her health. And one of the things that really shocks people is the idea that if you phone 911 because a family member is in crisis, in a health crisis, how can that family member wind up dead when the police arrive? So many people in the community have been saying that we should take away the money that the police currently get for responding to those kinds of 911 calls and put it somewhere else. And the somewhere else can be two different kinds of things. One is to have somebody else show up at the door, not a police officer, but a public health nurse or someone with training in sociology, as a social worker rather, who have the skills to help that person figure out, how to ground themselves, how to de-escalate the situation, but also to someone who knows what different kinds of supports and services exist in Toronto to help that person get well. It may be that what they need is someone to talk to, someone who can work with their doctor to develop a plan on how to stabilize them. It may mean that they need income supports or some kind of supports from a community agency to help them get through, the days and weeks that lie ahead of them. And all those kinds of conversations are things that we don't provide through the police service. That's not their expertise. So defunding can mean moving money out of the police to provide that service. Another thing that it can mean is maybe putting money in up front so that we have better social services every day, so that someone who suffers from a mental or health condition that puts them at risk already is seeing a social worker, already has access to excellent neighborhood level services so they don't get into crisis. That and taking money out of the police to fund that kind of program is another way that we talk about defunding the police. But it doesn't stop there. There are a lot of different things that the police respond to that really it doesn't make sense that you would need somebody who's armed and trained in lethal force and even sublethal force to deal with. Why, for example, is it the case that only a police officer can pull somebody over for driving through a stop sign or speeding on one of our streets? Why is it necessary that someone carry a gun to perform that function? Another area where there's been a lot of concern are calls relating to domestic violence or any of a whole bunch of different services, even criminal investigation. A police officer who is, driving around in a police cruiser doesn't necessarily have any forensic skills or investigative skills. They know how to take notes. They're trained in doing that when they arrive on a scene. But we bring in specialists to do those kinds of investigative functions. And you can actually look at almost everything the police do and ask yourself, is somebody carrying body armor and a gun the right person to deliver that service? So the defunding movement is not a conversation about eliminating services that keep us safe, but rather asking the question, is today's model where the police deliver those services the right one? So that's, I think, Clive, the key to the answer to the question that people have been asking. What is defunding?
You definitely.
What are there other aspects to what people have been asking that you wanted to raise?
I think some people feel that, that this is just going to be a one-time type of forget about it. So that we definitely need to keep our eyes on the situation and this past few years, but they're worried that at some point now that the conversation is going to die down and that there won't be any movement on that. Are there any comments that you can provide on that, Gordon?
Sure. Yeah, and that's really important. So, before I ran for office, I worked as a community activist on environmental issues for about 20 years. And one of the lessons that I really learned there is that whatever issue you're working on, there are going to be key moments, right? There's going to be a moment when everyone is thinking about it. It's on everyone's mind. And those moments come and then they go. This isn't the first time that we've, had the issue of anti-Black racism structurally within our police force and frankly within all city services come in front of council. We've had a lot of cases. Andrew Loku comes to mind as one. We have a housing project in Parkdale that's actually named after a young man who died during a mental health interaction with the Toronto police. So this keeps coming up, but there's never been a moment like the one we're in now, where the whole world, frankly, watching and protesting and calling on governments to do something. And the moment won't last forever. So what I'm really looking for in whatever we decide to do in council is two things. One, we take some immediate steps, right? We approve some decisions at council that will be lasting and permanent and make real change. But the other is that we set in motion a transparent and public and highly visible process for continuing the momentum. One of the things that can really go wrong in a moment like this is if we pull the conversation and into council's hands and into the hands of the public service, and then you never hear from it again. So whatever comes in front of council, the other thing I'm going to be looking for is, do the steps we imagine in the future happen in a way where there's a lot of public access and inclusion in the conversation, where there are clear and repeated moments of reporting out where we are to the public that will force council to debate this at each of the moments that the steps are happening. If we let it happen just within the police service or just within the Toronto Public Service, at some point, something else will seize the public imagination. And there's a risk that all the future work on this just fades away behind the noise of whatever new moment of political controversy or public interest is happening in 6 months or a year or 2 years. Anything else, Clive?
No, that's basically it with regards to like the phone calls that I've been getting from folks. But as you mentioned, this is the first time that we've been looking at this, and there are alternative ways to look at how to deal with the police and the services. So yeah. I think my colleague can speak on that.
Good. Who is next?
So Gord, maybe continuing on the thread of talking about the government's responsibilities and different roles they can play, there is a bit of confusion around, if we're defunding, what's the role of the Toronto Police Services Board? What's the role of the city on that? And what's the role of the province? So that organizers know where to focus their efforts as well. So could you explain some of that?
Yeah, so policing in Canada is, the jurisdictions are really tricky and really messy. For example, city council doesn't decide what is and what is not a criminal offense. The federal government does that. They have jurisdiction over what's called the criminal code. So for example, it's the federal government that decides that using drugs is a criminal offense. And as we saw recently, when they took cannabis out, or parts of the legislation around cannabis out of the criminal code, you can now sell marijuana and other cannabis products legally in a storefront. So right there, that took a whole bunch of stuff that the police were in charge of and said, this is no longer an issue for police. This is now just business. So that's an example of how jurisdictions can be tricky. The big one, though, is the relationship between the City of Toronto, the Police Service Board, and the Province of Ontario. Everyone will remember last election, Doug Ford just decided that even though we had a robust public consultation process and council had taken a decision to redraw the boundaries and slightly increase the number of city councillors, with a single piece of legislation, he just came in and cut the size of council in half. Now, we are appealing that to the Supreme Court of Canada, but it's an example of the extent to which the province has control of what local municipalities do. And nowhere is that control bigger than with the issue of policing. Right now, in provincial law, they decide who oversees the police. They have something that sets out police service boards, so the governing that oversees the local chief. They write the legislation for who sits on those police services boards, what powers those police services boards have, and how the province oversees police service boards. They can actually step in and take over a local police services board under provincial law right now. They could also change the composition of police services boards. Presently, the way it works is the legislation says that half of a police service board is provincial appointees, half is members of the local council, and one individual is appointed by the local council who doesn't sit on council. But they can change that anytime they want. The other thing that legislation does, another thing that legislation does, is give the police service board absolute authority for how they allocate money within the police service budget, which means city council can't say you spend too much money on your armed SWAT teams and not enough money on community policing, and you have to move some from one to the other. We can't say we will not give you any money for surveillance in low-income neighborhoods. If the police want to allocate money to that and the police service board agrees with them, city council can't say no. We also can't say what kinds of things the police police and what kinds of things we take away from them. For example, it's in provincial law that only a police officer can stop a moving vehicle. We can't issue tickets if the vehicle is moving using just regular city staff. And we issue all kinds of tickets for other kinds of things that the police don't do. The public health can issue tickets to a restaurant that is not meeting cleanliness standards. The fire department can lay charges if you're in violation of the fire code. We have something called property standards, which our municipal licensing and standards can issue against a property owner if it's, if they've got garbage in their front lawn, and it goes on and on and on. Also, in the provincial legislation is a provision that they control investigations into police conduct and when someone is injured or killed in an interaction with the police. That's the Special Investigations Unit, the SIU. That body is entirely controlled, hired, appointed, and overseen by the provincial government, or rather an agency of the provincial government. That same body that oversees the SIU, not the SIU itself, also has oversight of the conduct of police service boards and sits if a police service board feels the municipality is not giving them enough money, the police service board can appeal the local municipal government's budget to that same entity. So if the police ask us for $1.25 billion and we say, no, we think that's too much, we're only giving you $1 billion, the police service board can take the municipality to a provincial body and ask for a ruling. And if the ruling is on the side of the police service board, the local municipality has to give them that additional money. So we, as a city, we don't decide what the officers are doing. We don't decide where money goes within the police budget. We don't decide what the training is for police officers. We don't decide who responds to 911 calls. We don't decide what the union contracts will look like, because since the police are considered an essential service, provincial arbitrator steps in between the police service board and the police officers and sets those rates of pay and work conditions. And we can't even decide what the final budget is. So we have almost no power over what the police do in the city of Toronto as a council. That's very different from how it works in the US.
So continuing on that thread, maybe you can explain for organizers who are, asking their city councilors and the mayor to take action, where do you see the opportunities that the city can really play a role in having an impact on this?
So the reason I'm a local city councilor and I don't run for another order of government, and I've been asked and I just said, no, I'm not interested, don't ask me again, is because this is the most permeable or transparent level of government anywhere in the whole system. I don't have a party that signs my nomination paper. I just decide to run and I'm a free actor. We don't have a government and an opposition. Any member of council can vote any way they want. And that means that more than any other elected official, a municipal elected official speaks for the people they represent and no one else. And so it gives a moment where if people in Toronto really want someone to speak up and say, yes, it's time to take things away from the police and deliver them differently, I think Toronto City Councillors have a unique moment to do that. And it's important that we just simply make that statement. The other thing that we can do, though, is we can really force the question. We can say to the Toronto Police Service Board, we're going to give you less money. And if you want to go to a provincial appeal and tell us that we have to give you more money, that makes it plain to everybody who's really in charge. And I think that's important. If we do succeed at council in taking money out of the police budget so that we can spend it somewhere that provides the service, the safety service in a better way, and the province overrules us, that really puts the heat on Doug Ford directly. If we also say, we want you, Doug Ford, to change the Police Services Act so that local governments do have that budgetary control and can decide whether they want the police to deliver a certain service or whether they want somebody to train differently, perhaps in mental health or in dealing with rape crisis or in dealing with building strong communities or in investing in young Black men, anything else. And Doug Ford says, no, not going to give you, as the City of Toronto, those powers. That also backs him into a corner and makes it very apparent. And I think the reason why, instead of activists just going straight to Doug Ford, it's important that we come to council first. Is it's one thing for Doug Ford to ignore a bunch of activists, right? He does it all the time. It's because they have that government and opposition structure there. Even MPPs who are elected in the City of Toronto to be part of his government can hide behind that government opposition structure. So I think it's a really important moment when Toronto City Councillors take a side. We are with Black people, we are with Indigenous people, we are with racialized people, and we are with our constituents on the side of taking resources out of the police and investing in a different way in creating safe and inclusive communities. And we are opposed to a provincial government that won't give us those powers. I think it just sets up an entirely different political dynamic. And it's also, to go back to something Clive was asking about, a way of keeping the momentum and the public debate and struggle around this issue really on the front burner. Anything else, Dushan?
No, that's it. I mean, I think that provides a real clear explanation around the different roles the governments play and what people can do in terms of focusing their energies as well as they continue to work.
And by the way, always write your provincial government Always, 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 always. I just sort of make it like a weekly thing, put it in your calendar. You know, oh, it's Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I have to write my letter to the provincial government. Anything. So what's next?
So I wanted to ask some questions around looking forward. So in the future, what kind of models could we be seeing? I know you touched on mental health being a big issue, and that's something that we've heard a lot of from residents, is concerns around mental health crisis and response from police. And I was wondering what types of models you could see as being effective in Toronto.
Yeah. So I want to break that question into two parts. One is, you know, what do we do generally about violence in our communities, right? Because that's a lot of what I hear talking to people is when they hear defund, they get this idea that we're not going to do anything to keep people safe from violence, and we'll just deal with that narrow question. So when I first was elected, there was had recently been something called the Summer of the Gun, when a lot of people, there was a lot of gun violence. And you might remember a young girl lost her life around the Eaton Center. And the provincial government appointed two former cabinet ministers, one Liberal and one Conservative, Roy McMurtry and Alvin Curling. Alvin was the Liberal and Roy was the Conservative, and tasked them with looking at the question of why violence happens in our communities, why gang violence particularly happens in our communities, and what works to get rid of it. And they did what was, I believe, the most exhaustive look ever done in any English language speaking country in the world. And they also not only looked at all the social science and all the data from different jurisdictions and all the different models. They also went out and met with community leaders. They spoke with young Black men in communities where there was gang activity. They looked at community leaders who were delivering programs from a not-for-profit lens about dealing with it. And they came up with a report called The Roots of Violence. What they found is there is no evidence anywhere that increasing police presence or increasing the resources to the police reduces the amount of gang violence in a community. Zero evidence that that happens. And I want everyone to stop and think about that. The biggest single line in Toronto's budget is for the police service. The biggest reason given for that is guns and gangs. And there is no evidence that we can find anywhere in the world that investing in police to do something about guns and gangs produces any benefit at all. That's really important to know. What they did find is that if we invest through community organizations, through breakfast programs, through better school resources, through creating mentoring, basically, if we tell Black boys and young Black men, we care about you, right? You are valued. You are so valued that we create special programs to help you have your best life. That is so different from the message that young Black men get in some neighborhoods in Toronto right now, which is we suspect you, we fear you, and we handle you by sending a large adult who is wearing something that looks like battle armor and carrying a gun. That's how we think we have to handle you. And what all the evidence shows is that if you make those investments, you get a marked reduction in the amount of gun violence as those Black boys grow up into being men. And it works, you know, in all communities, but it's particularly important for young Black men who right now are the most marginalized children that we have, and young adults that we have in our society, together with Indigenous people. So that's the first part. don't invest in any kind of or don't make your first investment into a 911 response when something goes wrong. Make your first investment into young people who currently are marginalized, racialized, and victimized in our society. The second thing that we have to think about is there are still going to be emergencies and crises. And what do we do in that emergency? There are a lot of different models out there, a lot of bits and pieces we can draw from. I don't think anybody's got the whole answer. Two things that I'm carrying in my mind right now. The first is, for most of its history, the police forces in London, England, and many British cities did not carry guns. They simply didn't carry it. And they handled all of their policing without guns. Now, they did have some special units that responded to crises without guns. So that's an important piece. Another piece, a model, actually, Catherine, that you drew my attention to during our last conversation, is an American city, Eugene, Oregon. I think about 30 years ago, they decided that for mental health calls, they would not respond. Their first response would not be with a police officer. It would be with a social worker and a mental health worker. And they actually didn't even deliver that from the government. They went to a not-for-profit agency in the community that specialized in mental health and mental wellness. And so what happens is someone dials 911 and the dispatcher doesn't even call the police. They call this organization who has teams available 24/7 throughout the city. The program is called Cahoots. And from what I understand, they do a couple 100,000 calls a year. And it is only, I think it's less than 10% of the calls, does that first response team decide they need a police officer to come and help them. Think of that. If we could get rid of 90% of those 911 calls, take away any risk that someone's going to get beaten or tasered or thrown in jail or die, instead get someone on the path to wellness. We've done an enormous public service. We've reduced the role of the police, shrinking it down to something closer to only responding when there's extreme risk and extreme violence. And by the way, saved a lot of money so that you have more money for investing in all the other public services that are currently underfunded. Those are some pieces of the model. But that I think we need to look at a whole lot of other pieces as well.
Thanks, Gord. I know there's a couple pieces that I'm thinking of, and you mentioned earlier around traffic, and another piece around decriminalization, and the role of those pieces and what they could look like in Toronto. I was wondering if you could speak to those.
Actually, I'm really glad you mentioned decriminalization. I'll address them both. But decriminalization is something that I've worked on pretty much my whole time on council. So when I first arrived on city council, we did not yet have the opioid crisis, which was causing the death of, the leading cause of death, frankly, young people in Canada. But we did have a drug overdose problem. And the city of Toronto and many other cities in Canada were looking at Europe, where they were moving from a model where drug use was treated as simply a criminal problem to a health problem. And I fought for, and it took, I think 12 years to get safe injection services in the city of Toronto, where instead of someone using drugs being at risk of dying or going into an overdose and having someone have to call 911 and have an ambulance and police show up, they would use their drugs in a safe setting, and if something went wrong, a nurse or a trained harm reduction worker would deal with you. Similarly, we did other harm reduction things. We started handing out safe supplies for crack pipes and injection drug use through community health organizations. When I first started, we had the absurd situation where a harm reduction worker would give someone a safe needle or a safe crack pipe so they weren't passing HIV, AIDS, or other diseases through the equipment they were using. And 5 minutes later, a police officer would stop them and destroy the equipment because drug paraphernalia, holding drug paraphernalia was considered to be a crime under the criminal code. I was able to get together with a lot of harm reduction workers and a lot of members of council that all moved over as harm reduction work. Imagine if the fact of simple possession of an opioid or other drug was no longer criminal. You can have a conversation about, people importing large quantities of, surreptitiously manufactured drugs, and whether that creates a safe supply and how you want to regulate that. But there is a robust conversation, and actually a number of police chiefs are entering into it saying we should decriminalize drugs and manage them as a health issue, at least for simple possession. And I know there's been a private member's bill at the federal level. We're having, the city of Toronto's Public Health Board has endorsed that position. And I chair a group that's multi-sectoral in Toronto through our drug strategy, where we're trying to flesh out and have a large conversation about how you can deal with drug use as a non-criminal issue. The other piece of that, of course, is given that the illicit drug supply is so dangerous right now because of contamination with fentanyl and carfentanil and actually a whole lot of other things that are being mixed in. Maybe having what we call safe supply, which is publicly manufactured drugs available on a prescription basis, is another component of taking it out of the criminal justice system and treating drug use as a health issue. Now, before I leave this, I want to go back to the other part of your question, which is traffic and traffic enforcement. We have a really convoluted system of traffic enforcement in the city of Toronto. As I said earlier, only a police officer can stop a movement. Then they issue a traffic ticket. Then the city of Toronto actually takes responsibility for managing that ticket through the court system and collecting the fines if the fine is contested. If it's not contested, we just collect the fine. If it is, there's a hearing and we collect whatever the judge decides is appropriate at the end of the day. A few years ago, some of us on council did succeed in slightly constraining the growth of the police services budget. We didn't cut it, but we stopped it from growing at the rate that the police service wanted. Very quickly after that, the police service started saying, well, because we didn't get all the money that we asked for, we had to make some choices for what services not to deliver. And we don't have enough officers to deploy to handle all the traffic offenses. And we noticed immediately a very sharp drop, about $20 million a year in the revenues from those traffic tickets that police used to hand out. And we have been going back and forth every year when the police budget comes to council. I put the police chief or the representative of the police board, sort of on the stand, and I say, why is this happening? Why won't you do more about this? And I get the city solicitor to answer the question, why is it we can't deal with this on our own? To my mind, if someone blows through a stop sign, there's no reason for the guy who takes their license plate, pulls them over, takes their license and registration down and issues them a ticket to be someone who's carrying a gun. I don't see the correlation. Like what percentage of traffic tickets result in gunplay? Just about, minuscule, less than 0.01%, I'm sure. So that's another area which, there would be more than one benefit if it was delivered differently. I've had very many Black, Indigenous, and racialized people tell me that they feel they get pulled over. What's the saying? Driving while Black. They get pulled over a lot more. That I haven't seen statistics, but I know that criminal charges are disproportionate on those populations. It may well be the case that the being stopped while driving is disproportionate too. So we could maybe solve that problem. We would solve a revenue problem, which is important to bear in mind, because again, that's more money for investing in people up front and creating a more just and inclusive city. So there's all kinds of benefits about taking that service and delivering it a different way too. Any other questions or thoughts? No? Maybe. Oh, Clive, go ahead.
Yeah, no, basically you've touched on a lot of it, and especially with the questions and things that I've been getting when speaking to them on the phone. But we touched on this earlier, but maybe as a final thought, what can someone do now? Like as a citizen, what should they be doing moving forward on this if they really care about this issue?
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing I say to everybody who asks me that question, about whatever issue it is, right? Whatever issue it is, you are, whether you're legally a documented citizen of Canada or not, for all intents and purposes, you are part of the democracy in Toronto, right? And a mistake people often make is thinking democracy is the process by which you elect a government to govern you. And that's not the case. Democracy is something you do every single day. And you can do it more or less, better or worse. If democracy for you is, occasionally grumbling about a headline you see on Facebook or something, and then dragging yourself out to vote, you're not doing democracy very well. And that's harsh, but you're not. Democracy is remembering that the way we choose to govern ourselves is part of something you do every day. Every single day, you run into a service that we as a city decided to deliver and to collect taxes to pay for. So every day, those decisions are having an impact on your life. So you can't get away from dealing with government every day. The trick is to change from a passive relationship to government, where you just receive services, to an active one, where you take part in deciding what those services are. And you do it in two most important ways. One is by getting involved with some kind of community organization or political organization. Joining a political party is an obvious one, but joining a neighborhood group, maybe that focuses on your neighborhood, is another way. I also come out of movement politics. I spent 20 years working in the environmental movement, and I always encourage people, that's actually I think, the most rewarding way to get involved. Think about what it is that matters to you. What issues matter to you in life? What would you like to give a couple hours of your time to every week or every month? Ralph Nader, who's some of his politics I agree with, some I don't, once said a very famous thing. If 1% of everybody in a country gave 10 hours and $10 every week to the political cause they cared about the most, we would completely transform society. We would completely change it. So part of, I think, the job of being, demos, a member of a democracy, is to think that government is interacting with your life every day anyway. React actively, and I actively is the key word. Get active, and the other piece of doing that work is remembering all of us belong to all kinds of social circles, right? There's a writer, again, I agree with some of his politics, but not all, called Robert Putnam. He wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone, and he did a lot of work studying different municipal governments after World War II in Italy, and looking at all kinds of different ways that people interact with each other, and then looking at how much of that activity took place in a city, and then which cities have developed after World War II the most open, transparent, and effective governments. And he found absolutely startling stuff. You can correlate a city that has a lot of choirs with transparent and open and inclusive government. And why is that? Well, what he argues is that the more things we do together instead of privately, right? The more we learn and share and grow as adults in groups, the more it is natural for us to think managing our city is a collective activity. So you all belong to some kind of a group. It might be a church you belong to. It might be, if you had parents like mine, a bridge club. It might be a gaming club that you do, online with some pals. My son, twice a week, he and his buddies have a set time for gaming. It could be anything. It could be a group of people who socialize after work. Used to, I guess, and maybe will again after the pandemic goes away. Be mindful of those groups that you are involved in. Don't become a bore like me, and during a rubber or bridge say, "Well, how about that Donald Trump?" Don't be that guy, but keep your ears open and your mind open to moments that we call them teachable moments, when a topic of conversation comes up and somebody says something offhand, and boy, the government sure screwed that up, or my taxes are too high, or whatever, things people say during social conversations. And just sort of gently think about, is this a moment where I can say, I'm actually someone who volunteers in a cause, because I think just complaining about government doesn't really get anything done, but being active about how we govern ourselves does. Just be ready in those circles to talk about the issues of the day, to talk about democracy, and how deeply necessary it is that all of us view ourselves as active actors in government, particularly in moments like this, because everybody is going to be talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and about the horrible problems we've been seeing with how the RCMP police Indigenous communities, and the terrible, terrible images we're getting with wellness checks, and the staggering rates at which Black and Indigenous communities are policed and incarcerated in Canada. and the way that all of the systems, all of the services that we deliver at all levels of government work together to create fewer paths and opportunities for racialized people. And this is a moment we don't get to have very often in Toronto or in Canada. And please take the moment and do something. I think that's it, Catherine. I think this is a good place to call it.